The Ramblings of an Ant, a collection of works written by Anthony Gallucci. Dedication. To my dad, Richard Rit A. Gallucci. To my daughters, Kaya, Imani, and Anais Simone, and my son, Elijah. And to my hometown of Ithaca, New York, the 607. Introduction. Sitting in a state of semi-quarantine and social distance, I am excited to have the spaciousness to revisit the first book I ever published. I have gone through with care and highlighted certain passages throughout the text in an effort to make it easier for readers to extract the main points from the pieces. I have also proofread and revamped every article and updated them to the context of 2020. I hope you enjoy the various pieces, and surely we will all be better off once the current COVID-19 pandemic is behind us. The Issue of Wealth. The reality in the United States of America is the reality of the class line. The class line refers to the existence of a rigid class structure that rarely allows or encourages upward economic mobility. The established classes have been referenced as poverty, working class, middle class, and upper class. The class line is structured along and within the established classes. The main role of the class line is to maintain a socioeconomic imbalance consisting solely of those who have and those who have not. Poverty in the United States of America is often imposed and prolonged by the class line and the socioeconomic imbalance. Too many people living in poverty were born into poverty. Individuals and families living in poverty have no identifiable trait, quality, or characteristic that predisposes them to living in poverty. To the contrary, people living in poverty in the U.S. merely exist at the bottom of a rigid and imbalanced societal class caste structure. Therefore, it is the duty of our entire society to amend our approaches to economic welfare and other human rights. There is a plethora of statistics that expose the imbalance of wealth in the U.S. In addition, research has been conducted on the existence of the class line within class groups. It is important to acknowledge the discrepancies in economics and the limitations of the United States socioeconomic structure to understand that the imbalance negatively affects us all. We must all heed the fact that we all are invested in our future. In the United States of America, the dominating school of thought regarding the reason and cause of poverty exudes a we versus them mentality. Most often, the cause of a person's poverty is perceived as their problem and their fault. Under this pretense, poverty is then perceived as stemming from the inability of the lowest socioeconomic class to play a competent, educated, and able role in their attempt to achieve socioeconomic upward advancement. The mentality has kept the various classes separated and unwilling to collaborate to end our collective struggle to provide for our people. In addition, the logic of we versus them ignores the role that society plays in handicapping, funneling, limiting, and maintaining people in the economic imbalance and structure. The we role and ideology is held by people who believe themselves to be economically better off than others. This role and ideology are often found in various classes, regardless of the reality of the individual's position in the economic structure. Therefore, the we in any given class grouping often ignores and/or disregards their limited economic status and focuses instead on their elevated class status, so-called privilege, over others. The focus, however, is not salient. The we learns to enjoy the feeling of privilege over others, and it begins to falsely internalize the feelings as earned. Once the actions and feelings seem to have been earned, the we can justify perceiving a lack of effort in others. The we often are blinded to their role in an effort to guiltlessly justify and project underthought and/or ignorant rationale regarding the reasons people live in poverty. The rationale is detrimental in that it stigmatizes people living in poverty as lazy, unmotivated, and uneducated. The stigma attached to people in poverty is expanded upon to become a reaction of excusing, ignoring, and sustaining an inequitable socioeconomic imbalance. By ignoring the reality that most individuals are exploited by the structure, we sustain the we versus them mentality, the class line, and socioeconomic imbalance. In our heart of hearts, we know that no person has a choice about the socioeconomic class they are born into. We do, however, participate in our decisions about what we do with what we have. It would be naive to assume that we all receive equal access and opportunity, and that the barriers to upward mobility are the same across the classes. Therefore, assuming that people in poverty are lazy is to ignore the reality of our socioeconomic imbalanced structure and to assume that the United States of America has a fluid class structure. To the contrary, in the United States of America, wealth and socioeconomic status are rigid, rarely earned, and most often afforded through the hard work of lower classes. Ideology aside, the main issue with wealth in America is that the people who live under its robe are most often having their human rights violated, i.e., subpar living standards, starvation, ill-treated water, and lack of health care, and many more. Our world has the resources, and our people have the ability to sustain our entire population. If we must all become committed to ourselves through each other. Reestablishing Masculinity. In the 21st century United States of America, the rise of the hashtag #MeToo and the hashtag Black Women Lives Matter movements have revitalized the discussions and need for actions concerning abolishing gender, the hierarchy, gender-based discrimination and inequity, and misogyny in all forms. One aspect of the perpetuation of gender discrimination is the social conditioning, condoning, and perpetuating of toxic attributes upon the gender expression identity of masculine. This piece attempts to begin to redirect the lens towards promotion of virtuous rather than continuing to replicate the toxic in masculinity. The gender duality under which we in the United States of America are currently conditioned is often isolated within the gender spectrums of cisgender woman to cisgender male and transgender woman to transgender male. There is a plethora of attributes, virtuous and non-virtuous, associated with gender identities and gender identity characteristic expressions, which are independent of any one's individual ethos, karma, actions, morality, or the ethics of one's cultural conditioning or acculturation within a specific perceived gender identity grouping, context. In the United States, there exists an unearned and illogical power position hierarchy which places the cisgender male and the male-based masculine gender identity characteristic expressions at the top. The gender identity characteristic expression based caste system perpetuates inequity, bias, and bigotry regarding gender identity and the characteristics commonly attributed to varying expression and within the same gender identity expression. Specifically biased against cisgender females, transgender people, and feminine characteristic identified people, and female gender identified people who identify with masculine identity characteristic expressions. To counter the root creator, benefactor, and cause of the gender hierarchies, aka the conditioned misogyny inherent to patriarchy, some cisgender males and people who identify with a masculine gender characteristic expression have taken the baton from the #MeToo and the Black Women Lives Matter movements of the contemporary and the past, and are engaged in the poignant effort to reestablish masculinity as non-toxic. The neo-non-toxic masculinity movement serves to provide a space to evolve the discussions regarding transitioning toxic masculinity into virtuous masculine behaviors, praxis, and actions. In this iteration, the Reestablishing Masculinity movement is welcoming to all, and the onus of reestablishing masculinity as non-toxic will never be pushed onto people whom do not identify with the characteristic expressions of masculinity. To the contrary, those whom identify with the masculine gender characteristic expression are encouraged to work from that position to create and actualize methods for disengaging oneself from an unearned power position and make progress to holistic embodiment of the virtuous qualities of masculine characteristics, i.e., virtuously expressed, discipline, compassion, courage, nurturing, leadership, etc. The intentions behind the movement to reestablish the gender identity characteristic expression of masculinity as non-toxic is to ultimately dismantle the gender-based hierarchies by re-actualizing gender identity characteristic expressions of masculinity as a non-restrictive, non-oppressive, and as a virtuous gender identity characteristic expression-based identity. In 2020, cisgender males and people who identify with a masculine gender characteristic expression ought to view this effort as necessary, evolutionary, poignant, brave, and foresighted. I look forward to your engagement. The Green Gaze. The movements to engage one's spiritual practice in sustainable social behaviors is themed around the plausible power in the meshing of neo-sustainability efforts with the gnosis of wisdom traditions, religions, in an effort to invigorate collective and holistic, non-toxic ecological praxis. Well-meaning people sometimes assume that environmental sustainability efforts are innate to the concerns of most wisdom traditions. Therefore, it is often implied that any unsustainable, ecocide, or eco-terroristic acts of any given wisdom tradition are the fault of the societal, cultural influences the wisdom practice is encompassed or surrounded by, rather than the laissez-faire, spiritual narcissistic, esoteric, non-dualistic, or isolationist approaches of some wisdom conventions. The reality may be that a middle way exists in which both perspectives hold certain relevancy and validity. In our time of collective ecological decay, we must hold space for and thresh out the discussions and actions regarding the place of wisdom traditions in collaborating and supporting of the eco-sustainability global movements already upon us. For example, Rise for Climate, 350.org, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, Earth Guardians, etc. We ought to begin by establishing the relevancy that the teachings explicit to various text-based doctrines of wisdom traditions may hold for environmental critique efforts, initiating wisdom tradition-sponsored sustainability efforts, encouraging eco-friendliness, and sustaining sustainability efforts which already have begun. Next, we could suggest how one could actualize theistic, panentheistic, philosophical, and wisdom ideologies into behaviors which serve to diminish and ultimately abolish ecocide. To conclude, we can offer opportunities for people to utilize various wisdom traditions in an effort to actualize a virtuous and sustainable ecology. For example, one could represent basic tenets of ancient Tibetan Buddhism in a lens which promotes virtuous sustainability. In foundational Tibetan Buddhist tradition, one of the most practiced group of schools of Buddhism in the United States, there are certain moral standards which are established for all practitioners of the Dharma path. The sacred Buddhist doctrine which expresses the moral standards which are relevant to our ecology, relationship with this earth, is the 5 precepts. The first and second of the 5 precepts of ancient Tibetan Buddhism are specifically poignant to the discussion around the Buddhist obligation to certain behaviors which may help to sustain health and life on the planet. The first precept, I undertake the precept to refrain from destroying living creatures, and the second precept, I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. The overarching theme of abiding by the behavioral suggestions of the 5 precepts of ancient Tibetan Buddhism could be put to action on a global scale through individual ethical efforts inspired by one's wisdom tradition. In the context of Buddhism, one way to respect the first precept would be to minimize one's intake of meat and try to eat sustainable sourced, ethically slaughtered, and organic livestock, poultry, or seafood. One way to abide by the second precept could be to join the anti-fracking efforts and activate against the theft of non-sustainable resources from the environment by supporting the traditional hydrofracker in finding and securing alternative, ecologically sustainable, and empowering forms of income to sustain a family. In short, the implications to the sustainability movement which wisdom traditions can serve are great and virtuous. Please intend to continue the necessary work of engaging our community, our faith, spirituality, and our culture in the movement to withdraw and allow the earth to save itself and us. The Miseducation of the Gringo. I am a Black African, a Kabylonian, Jewish, Maltese, American, cisgender male. This short paper is to address the misconception that whiteness is a privilege in the United States of America, essentially exposing the miseducation of the Gringo. When addressing the impact of terminology such as whiteness on the development of social circumstances, culture, and personal lifestyle choices and approaches, it is relevant to define the terms being critiqued. The definitions are available at the end of this piece. The terms focused on in this piece are whiteness, so-called white-skinned people, non-white allies of white-skinned people, and white privilege. The problem. There is a common belief, promotion, and action perpetuated that the social position held by white-skinned people in the United States of America offers benefit, advantages, and/or favor that are hoarded and occasionally extended to non-white allies, due mainly to interest convergence. A suggestion. I argue that the position, though salient in the disproportionate allocation of resources and material towards white-skinned people and some non-white allies, is not a privilege. Simply, it is not a privilege to exploit, oppress, disenfranchise, or minimize another person to acquire more resources, materials, and access to them. Essentially, those behaviors can be defined as greed. The characteristic greed has been misconstrued to seem as innate to the being of whiteness, and therefore it is identified with and incorporated into lifestyle and culture of whiteness as seemingly natural, deserved, and an honorable venture for white people and non-white allies to partake in. An example, the exploitation of non-white people. Therefore, to the person whom embodies whiteness, giving it up is a dangerous and unnatural option that secures their exclusion from the so-called perceived privileged group that comes with participation and attempted or successful hegemony. A potential solution. We assert that if we call it what it is, then we won't be miseducated into thinking that whiteness is privileged. The impact of this terminology is not limited to white people's and non-white allies' perception and behavior resulting from it. To the contrary, all people are negatively impacted by the counter-evolutionary approaches to living that are exhibited through adopting whiteness as a guiding ideology, philosophy, religion, and indulgence. Furthermore, white people and white allies are well aware that this system of inequity exists to mask their inadequacies and to supply unearned advantages and a feeling of unearned entitlement that encompass the syndrome of white privilege. We decided relevant to briefly reimagine the points of privilege as established and highlighted by Ms. Peggy McIntosh in the article Unpacking the Knapsack, from the perspective of the people exploited by whiteness. Daily effects of the construction of so-called white privilege. I, too, decided to try to work on myself through identifying some of the daily effects of so-called white privilege in my life as an identified and identifiable black man. I have replicated those conditions that Miss McIntosh chose to illuminate from her experience as a middle-class white woman, merely for the sake of accurate rearticulation, reevaluation of her initial idea. 1. We have been restricted through laws and social constructions from our human right to be in places that we feel welcomed and present with our so-called race most of the time. 2. A history of segregation, inequitable land distribution, blatant favoritism in the credit and housing lending market for white people and sometimes for non-white allies have made it so if we should need to move, we cannot rent or purchase housing in an area we can afford and in which we would want to live. 3. Because of the fear and inferiority complex of white people, we cannot go shopping, driving, or otherwise out in communities and areas where white people and their non-white allies patronage alone most of the time, and be well assured that we will not be subjected to racial profiling, arrest, stalking, and/or harassment. 4. Because of whiteness-dominated media, we can rarely turn on the television or open the front page of the newspaper and see positive imagery of our race widely represented. 5. When we are indoctrinated within the United States education system, criminal justice system, we are told lies, exaggerations, and propaganda about our black national heritage or about the development of so-called civilization in our motherland that restricts human development to the limited history of, by, and for white people. 6. If I want to, I can be pretty sure that this piece will be deemed too black and too radical to find a mainstream publisher for this entire piece on so-called white privilege. 7. When using checks, credit cards, or cash, we can be assured that a white person will show their ignorance by judging my skin complexion as the barometer for their assessment of our appearance of financial reliability. 8. In the ignorant perception of the white person, we are always representatives for our entire race when we speak or do pretty much anything negative. 9. When we criticize our government and talk about how much we are disappointed with its policies and behaviors, we are always blacklisted, slandered, misrepresented, and labeled as racist, angry, and reactionary by fearful and incompetent white people and their non-white allies. 10. We cannot swear or dress in second-hand clothes or not answer letters without having an ignorant white person and or their non-white allies attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my blackness. Conclusion. Simply put, white people and some non-white allies are making choices to cheat. We have made a choice not to cheat, now and forever into the future. We know that someday all people will make the right choice for the sustainability and peace for all people on the planet. There ought to be a self-reflection on the part of white people and non-white allies if they feel uncomfortable with the topic. It should be a personal, psychological, emotional, and social reflection that could inspire positive, anti-exploitative behavioral changes. White people and allies need to seriously rethink this structure before things get even worse. Suggested terms. Whiteness. The socioeconomic and psychological promotion, practice, theology, and ideology of white European Western culture as the dominant group with perceived deserved access to benefit off of any structure engulfed in it. White person and non-white ally. An oppressive person with interest in and willing to participate and or embody whiteness as their guiding ideology, practice, promotion, theology, and social organizing tool. Note, Black and brown people can support whiteness. Everything and person that utilizes racial construction or socio-ethnic political hierarchy in an effort to oppress non-European people of the world. Privilege. A right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. Prerogative, especially, such a right or immunity attached specifically to a position or an office. It's from Webster's Dictionary. Origin of the word privilege. Middle English, from Anglo-French, from Latin, privilegium, law, for or against a private person, from private. Unearned entitlement. An unearned entitlement is the reality that white people or allies acquire their position of advantage, resources, through their ability to exploit other people. White people, white allies, however, cling to a false perception of hard work to justify their exploitation over others and to reimagine it as deserved social advantages and resources. Under this supposition of false accomplishment, white people and allies believe that they are entitled to keep perpetuating the exploitation of non-white people. Unearned advantage. An unearned advantage exists as a result of a majority whiteness-dominated society legitimizing the belief of unearned entitlement. When this happens, white people and white allies believe that any resource advantage received is a deserved benefit over someone else, and they continue oppressing people to gain acquire, secure, and hoard unearned advantages and resources. Honorary servants. A person who takes the social risk of empowering a dispossessed person or group of people. In addition, the honorary servant listens to and takes directions from the dispossessed group they are serving with no imposition whatsoever. A crucial component to being an honorary servant is to internalize the expressions from dispossessed people and implement the suggestions into personal behavioral adjustment that serves to exonerate the servant from being oppressive and also replaces oppressive behavior with the support, humility, and empathy required to inspire trustworthiness and trust that begets solidarity. The police murder yet another black person. Here is a list of a few of the Ithaca community's assertions regarding the individual and social reasons and justifications for the murder of a young black American person, Sean Greenwood, by the Ithaca Police Department and surrounding interstate task force. The corruption of the injustice system, urban, rural, college town drug use and trafficking, exclusive national ethos in the United States of America, lack of credible employment opportunities and or access to positions that yield hiring power for Black Americans, Brown Americans, First Nation, Latinx, etc. Personal vendetta and jealousy, unethical, incomplete, and otherwise faulty police trainings and practices. Police corruption, a lack of opportunities for social engagement that fruit quality, ethical, and complete representative power for all non-wealthy white males. Parenting struggles, compulsory educational system, imposition of a negative, self-fulfilling prophecies through the corruption and inequity of U.S. schools and the Ithaca City School District in specific to this case. Xenophobia, structures of class and poverty, misguided urban and rural conflict imposed by the class elite in a divisive effort to maintain the exploitative and exploitation of lower class people in our imposed social positions as economically dependent. Okay, go back and edit this from xenophobia. Xenophobia, structures of class and poverty, misguided urban and rural conflict imposed by the class elite in a divisive effort to maintain the exploitation of lower class people in our imposed social position as economically dependent upon a fiat capital system that offers little political and social representation for people living in poverty, and a plethora of additional observations and opinions. All of the suppositions are conclusions that upon further ethical, inclusive, and honest discussion could beget radical movement and remedial action that would plausibly inspire revolution towards implementation of individual and social solutions to the pandemic of police brutality. However, limiting our objectivity to the implications and reality of conforming political or academic debate and or policy changes within the current flawed socio-political structure allows for the opportunity for dangerous and simple separations from personal human reaction and leaves only a conditioned reality of individualistic, inhumane, and emotionally disconnected responses. I would like to humbly remind us that at the root of the conjecture regarding the murder of insert black person's name here is the fact that he, she, they is no longer alive. As a result, it is impossible to fully validate or invalidate who she, he, they was presently, or who they, she, he was to become as she, they, he grew older. Therefore, every defensive or offensive explanation or rationale dependent on character diagnosis as a barometer of justice or justification for the murder of yet another black person, purported as relevant to the circumstances that led to their murder and of the murder itself, are inherently misleading, incomplete, inaccurate, and inhumane. Partially as a result of micro and macro-aggressive bias entrenched in most public opinion, state investigation, or media conclusion, disengage from the only sensible reaction and rely on slander, exceptionalism, and petty debate. Edit. Go back, do that again from partially. Partially, as a result of the micro and macro aggressive bias entrenched in most public opinion, state investigations or media conclusion disengage from the only sensible reaction and rely on slander, exceptionalism, and petty debate most often. A suggestion. The people must secure individual and social, collectively constructed and implemented accountability for what has occurred and demand that it never occurs again, using the mechanisms of accountability as the method for assuring the end to the murdering of the people and the circumstances that perpetuate continual repression and oppression. In the sentiment of Clarice 13X, Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X, and many others, the people cannot denounce violence as long as violence continues to be perpetuated against us, end quote. To take the movement to creating an atmosphere of ethical and inclusive social accountability for people and social structures that produce violations of civil and human rights, in this case, murder of a human without due process of law, requires trust, cooperation, and commitment among people. A start to trusting one another is to be trustworthy, and for people to witness others working towards solidifying the respective self and faith in human potential and goodness required to produce trustworthiness. Fortunately, it is up to all of us to acknowledge our participation in the social deception that thrives on hate and creates the conditions that produce mistrust. Simply put, beyond the perceptions of social exceptionalism and the feelings of superiority supposedly justified upon our overaccumulation of material and thriving on a we versus they mentality, is the foundation of our national inclination to exist in peace. In the aftermath of any community's loss of yet another black person at the hands of the police, I call upon us to forge forward with producing our necessary individual and social behavioral adjustments required to install trust and ultimate peace for all by any means necessary. Raising adolescents in society. It is true that our society in the United States of America has designated the family, the school district, the police, and community organizations to raise our children. It is also true that most parents or guardians are working when their adolescent-aged child or children return home from school anywhere between 2 to 4 p.m., depending on their location. The circumstances are not the fault of the school district or the family because neither institution imposed the 40-hour work week. Furthermore, when a child is released from our compulsory schooling responsibility, they are no longer the legal obligation of the school districts. In our present societal state, by removing the family and the school district from the equation, we are left to rely on the police and the local service organizations, community centers, etc., The police department is often unsuccessful in supporting and occupying adolescents' time. This is simply because the police are a reactionary organization. Basically, police often protect and serve after an incident has occurred. The department does not seem to be equipped to provide a supportive, engaging, and consistent program serving adolescents. As a result, in many cases, it is illogical to think that calling the police will solve anything. When it comes to youth services, many places have a decent number of quality programs and organizations. There may still be youth who are not being reached. This is not always the fault of the organizations and programming. To the contrary of compulsory education, adolescents are not required to attend programming offered by the community. There is a decent amount of dedicated, self-directed, and engaged adolescents in our communities. Unfortunately, their conquest and social contributions are rarely credibly acknowledged. Politically, when we think about the way in which we treat the adolescents in many communities, it is eerily similar to the way we treat non-white people, non-cisgender males, and people living in poverty. For instance, and in terms of engaging the political process to produce salient change, the adolescent often finds themselves filling a token role on an executive board or in a pretentious position of mocked authority on a planning committee for a youth event. I encourage us individual adults to work in our spheres to honestly acknowledge adolescents by engaging them in credible social participation and creating social benefits from their social participation. Adults must also stand up together and engagingly support the older children, adolescents of our community. It is our social responsibility to identify, critique, and amend errors in our social constructions in hope that we will eventually cease to construct counter-evolutionary and neglectful approaches to the practice of the family. Additional suggestions. 1. Lobby the local correctional agencies to offer incarcerated adolescents engaging educational and constructive correctional programming. 2. Challenge the school districts to offer positive reinforcement to all students who exhibit behaviors that are socially appropriate and demand that none of its employees offer positive reinforcement for negative behaviors. 3. Utilize the police as a potential ally as you lobby for inclusive, equitably distributed, and accessible adolescent programming and services in your communities. Black farmers and urban gardeners come together. Lessons from Brooklyn for Tompkins County. Through DNA testing, I have discovered that my great-aunt was Liz Christie, one of the founders of the Green Guerrillas organization out of New York City. And in 2010, I was honored to attend the Black Farmers and Urban Gardeners Conference, Growing Health, Wealth, and Justice in Our Communities in Brooklyn, New York City. The gathering of numerous original people, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, to discuss, educate, and network around food security, farming rights, agricultural policy, the need for agricultural autonomy, and methods for achieving such a reality was inspirational and motivational. The conference began with Will Allen of Growing Power in Milwaukee, discussing the possibility of using technological development for the purpose of healthy food market sustainability, and closed with a personal peek into the concerns, remedies, and aspirations of downtown Brooklyn community agriculturists, historians, and urban farming operations. Since the closure of the conference, I have been contemplating how the experience could translate to non-urban local spaces like Tompkins County in upstate New York. The focus of the conference being Black farmers and urban gardeners, I thought to focus on how we can credibly create opportunities for Black people to farm and garden in Tompkins County's mildly urban and arable rural areas. It has been my own conjecture that urban farming is a plausible way to increase health in the urban communities, traditionally composed of Black and Latinx Americans. The Black Farmers and Urban Gardener Conference showed there are a plethora of individuals and organizations, locally and nationally, who agree. In reflecting on urban gardening and how to move forward on increasing Black farming in urban centers such as Brooklyn, I must remind people that however inspirational, a 1/16 or a quarter of an acre on one city block in a housing project is not going to provide a sustainable way to feed the people in the area. This is especially the case when the paid organizers and directors of these nonprofit organizations and operations rarely are chosen or empowered from within the communities being served. With limited financial backing, land and social investment, there surely would not be enough yield to afford for the undercutting of mass production farm products in the local food markets, nor for the sustainability of an independent people's food market. Optimistically, the motivation, the markets, the distribution networks, and the dedicated people already exist within urban centers. Therefore, adequate land space, ownership, and autonomy of ecology would secure a more independent and sustainable urban agriculture as a reality. In this new reality, the people could offer the access to year-round healthy foods that is required for individual behavioral change to beget cultural change in regards to healthy eating habits and outcomes. For this to happen, there needs to be an initial exchange of land space, ownership, and autonomy of ecology, voluntarily or involuntarily, from the private interest to the people whom inhabit the space. Secondly, there needs to be an increase in access, affordability, and social comfort offered or taken through land redistribution outside of the urban centers for people quarantined to urban centers, traditionally Black and Latinx Americans, mainly as a result of white flight. In regards to urban farming as an approach to ending food insecurity in Tompkins County and other suburban areas versus Brooklyn and more urban areas, we have slightly different geographically and social circumstances that could allow for healthy foods to reach all people. In terms of arable land, or land that could be cultivated to become again arable, we must look beyond land located in our downtown urban areas to include land on our hills, heights, and land-trusted spaces. With the vast landscape of Tompkins County, we must also think about urban farming not just in terms of utilization of land, permaculture, gardening, farming, etc., but also in terms of the actions or policies that will enable redistribution of land ownership in urban settings and redistribution of land space, ownership, and autonomy of ecology in our rural areas. The immediate goal ought to be, still, on increasing access to healthy foods and food choices for people living in urban areas. However, much effort should be put in transitioning into increasing access and ownership of land for people in the urban centers, specifically Black, Latinx, and Indigenous peoples, inside and outside of those urban centers. Without foresight, inclusion, and equitable redistribution of land space, ownership, and autonomy of ecology, a mere eighth of an acre can be a mockery, serving to create further disenfranchisement and distrust between people with access and those without. The above thoughts are merely a reminder that social transformation is an intricate, tireless, and selfless process. To secure health for all people and exemplify our supposed national exceptionalism takes commitment and sacrifice. We know what we need to do. It is the delusion of the availability of choice that keeps us choosing today's comfort over collective responsibility, sustainability, and future-mindedness. Remember, the world is small when we see each other as part of the same biosphere, community, with all beings as part of our evolutionary journey. Let's step up and make a big change. Terms. Land, space. Space is a concept that must be included in the discussion around sustainability. Space beyond the scope of the traditional discussion includes not only access to land, but the ability and comfort to participate in an ecology once land is made available or taken. Comfort in the sense of the feeling that comes with freedom and equity of access consistently available until a culture is able to be constructed through a sustainable and mutually beneficial ecology. Land ownership. The process or state of having so-called legitimate, state-sanctioned autonomy of ecology that empowers one to the rights of protection and privacy of said space land. The police department's main priority is to protect the non-consensual ownership rights of people over the land. Autonomy of ecology. The state of being independent and self-directed, governed in one's ability to have an unadulterated, comfortable, sensitive, mutually beneficial, and sustainable relationship with the earth. Note from the author. To remain relevant to the behavior of the majority who need to self-initiate the behavioral and psychological changes required for a collective evolution, I decided to remain under the simple supposition of John Locke treatise on the so-called logic of land ownership as an acceptable declaration of an innate human entitlement. To the contrary of the practices of the conquering of the western frontier, to the imperialism of Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, Myanmar, and many other states, I believe that we must devalue our exceptional stratification of beings that define people as superior and begets a feeling of entitlement over the rest of our biosphere and the other characters in our collective evolutionary narrative and journey. I apologize for being lofty versus truly pragmatic. However, with thought and patience, I know this approach to be constructive. Thank you for your time and attention, for time is our only commodity. Male privilege to kill. In my humble opinion, I believe that, in part, misconceptions of male privilege in the United States of America and recent heinous acts of white nationalistic, male-driven gun violence and murder all suggest that the combination of American and male can be historically and contemporarily perceived with some validity to be the most dangerous demographic in American history. I believe this danger is rooted in the perception of privilege that many American males believe entitles us to harass, abuse, neglect, and/or murder another being without concern, fear, or actuality of accountability. Accountability that, if imposed, could inspire remorse and the eventual adjustment of social behaviors toward positive evolution. The accountability can be imposed by oneself or from an outside force. Most cisgender males, myself included, have had indulged in the patriarchal thought process from unearned entitlement, harassment, abuse, or murder, to so-called privilege, immunity. Males often perpetuate misogyny without thinking about it. The process not only allows males to feel a sensation of ignorance, but also serves to exonerate males from needing to adjust misogynistic behaviors and/or the patriarchal social structure. Women in the United States of America, living under the shroud of negative male-initiated suppositions of male superiority, are often portrayed as promiscuous, property, lazy, incapable, undereducatable, dependent, and other simplistic male conclusions. The above mistruths serve to endanger women in the United States of America. Term: unearned entitlement. The reality that males acquire our position of advantage of resources through our willingness to exploit other people. Furthermore, males cling to a false perception of hard work, outdated stereotypes, and strength to justify our exploitation, abuse, and murder of others, and to reimagine it as a deserved social advantage or privilege. Under this supposition of false accomplishment, males believe that we are entitled to keep perpetuating the exploitation, abuse, and murder of non-male people. The Shambhala Hypocrisy harms validity of communal spiritual practice. Anteceding the arrest of an ex-Shambhala USA teacher, William Carolus, for suspicion of sexual assault on a child, and the concurrent opening of a criminal investigation into the sexual misconduct allegations against the lineage holder, leader of the Shambhala USA, Mimpam Rinpoche, it is relevant to remember that sexual assault and sex clergy misconduct are not behaviors that are permitted as meritorious by the foundational non-crazy wisdom of ancient Tibetan Buddhism, specifically the Law of the Five Precepts. The founding patriarch of Shambhala USA, Chögyam Trungpa, hailed from the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which has branches in South Africa. He founded Shambhala USA and Naropa University. He has been accused by past members of the Shambhala USA community of having committed, perpetuated, and condoned sexual assault and sex clergy misconduct as acceptable practices for himself, some of the Shambhala leadership and teachers, the holder of the spiritual lineage Ozel Tenzin, Thomas F. Rich, and his son, Mimpam Rinpoche. The history of misconduct within the Shambhala USA community is unable to be honestly and ethically ignored or mislabeled as being inaccurate, as representative of an ethos of spiritual narcissism and spiritual bypassing, which is endemic to Shambhala USA. In the case found within Shambhala USA, the symptoms of their spiritual narcissism and bypassing contradict the Tibetan Buddhist moral system of the Five Precepts. The Five Precepts act as minimal ethical requirements for the Tibetan Buddhist lay and monastic practitioner. The specific precept, which has been blatantly disregarded, is the third, to refrain from sexual misconduct. Further, the second precept also dissuades sexual assault and sex clergy misconduct by presenting the exception that one not take that which is not consented to. Some members of Shambhala USA are not living up to the ethical standards established by foundational Tibetan Buddhist thought. I assert, therefore, that Shambhala USA, though Tibetan Buddhist inspired, are not actually practicing Buddhism. I further claim that Shambhala USA is not validly encapsulated in or representative of the diversity of Buddhist thought. To the contrary, the insidious behaviors of members within the Shambhala community exposes that some are practitioners of something devoid of ethical, dharma, and esoteric essences. The Shambhala hypocrisy not only misrepresents the dharma path, it leads to suffering of oneself and others, and ultimately serves to minimize the validity of communal spiritual practice and the existence of a safe, equitable, and unexploitable space to practice Buddhist esotericism. The knowledge of Dharma, including the noble path to marrying one's karma and ethics, is not withheld from the Shambhala pseudo-Buddhist practitioner. To the contrary, it is clearly taught that in regards to not perpetuating sexual assault and sex clergy misconduct, the Noble Eightfold Path asserts that via the conduct, shila, of right action, one can refrain from taking that which is not given to them, and therefore cessation from sexual misconduct. Some members of the Shambhala community have ignored the Noble Eightfold Path by committing sexual assault and sex clergy misconduct, and through systematic cover-ups. According to Buddha, her prescription to stop ignorance is found in the knowledge and actualizing of the Noble Eightfold Path. In the spirit of compassion, may we someday applaud the Shambhala USA community for working holistically along the path to hold accountable the discrepancies between their spiritual teachings, outward promotions, and their standards and actualization of moral conduct. However, I cannot recommend that anyone lay in vain. In the interim, and on the backdrop of a recent push from Naropa University students in spring 2019 to boycott all institutional connections to Shambhala USA, client-based, curricular, professors, board members, trustee affiliates, etc., it is humbly recommended that everyone in Colorado community disengage all support from the Shambhala USA, the Boulder Shambhala Center, and the entirety of their programming. If one must engage with Shambhala, please be cautious and safe. Remember, virtuous people, to take care as we attempt to take out the arrow of suffering. Let us not fail the path and fall upon the sword. Are gradualism and complacency hegemonic? In a time when social and educational equity could be a reality, we look around our United States of American schools and still find a lack of diversity that could create true equity. Apparent in almost every school system, there is an atmosphere of segregation based on class and race. Underlying the reality of segregation, our schools lack the role models and dedication to encourage a social transformation away from this neo-Jim Crow practice present in 2020. If we look a little further, we can see that schools stifle the diversity of social approaches, specifically among ethnic minorities within the disunited states of America. For instance, the common disposition imposed upon a minority district employee as a barometer for their success and credibility are impartiality and complacency. The complexity of the Du Boisian double consciousness explains the phenomenon. Contrary to common practice, there are benefits to encouraging the alternative approaches of transformative and empowering education. These approaches could foster young people who are educated, socially aware, and active in the constructive, virtuous, and equitable transformation of our society. Potentially, empowered and transformative youth could grow to diversify the United States of American school districts' employment pools. Simply put, everyone needs and deserves positive and empowering models, and providing them is always a priority. A letter on the great 20th century mystic and black philosopher, Dr. Howard Thurman. The video talks by the great black American philosopher, Dr. Howard Thurman, on the internet were impactful and mesmerizing. I watched the videos, and then I have played snippets of the videos and listened while doing morning dishes. My entire family has been engulfed in black Christian mysticism and the black experience in America this past week. One part of the video that struck me was the story of the traveling to India to meet Gandhi with the black missionary group. I was excited to hear that Gandhi was excited to meet a powerful and iconoclastic representative of the black church of Christianity. I always wondered how Gandhi was able to support the black rights movements in the 1960s. I am starting to see that Gandhi's connection to Martin Luther King may have been assisted by the intermediary of Howard Thurman. It has been told that the words and insight put to text, books of Howard Thurman were inspirational to Martin Luther King Jr. in his establishing a lens of all people as equal in regards to deserving human rights, decency, and dignity. I plan to explore the connections between the two powerful Black American people as I continue my studies. I am also again taken aback by the reality that too many Black Americans are blind participants in the Black church. In response to Gandhi asking Howard Thurman, "Why do you all, Black Americans, follow the God of your masters, oppressors?" I would probably have said, "I have no effing idea." I would probably be embarrassed by the perception that I was a sheep following the wolfish white oppressor master to slaughter. I would even begin to suppose about how I may actually be misled in an effort to devalue my potential. Fear. To be disinherited, scorned by God. I, in my blackness, am an expression of God, as is all. I can never be scorned, disinherited by God. I can only have people attempt to disinherit or scorn me. "Why are you not Muslim?" said Gandhi, and no one else ever in the 21st century. In the era of Modi and Donald Trump, it is hard to perceive of an ethnic Indian person actually pondering why someone ought to be Muslim for the faith's ability to see all as equals. There are many Muslim people on the planet, and maybe Gandhi was tapping into why that may be. I have known many Black American people, and I am one. And most of the Black American people I meet are somehow caught up in the Master's church. The struggle to be a part of tradition which excludes you is an act of faith, for sure. Quote, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" End quote, by Marion Williams. I may have been. To be Black in America is to live without and outside of non-duality and duality all the time. The Black double consciousness is one of duality playing within a non-duality, as is everything which appears to exist. I see Black people in America and mysticism as innately intertwined due to the nature of the experiment which rose the phenomena of Black America. At the same time, I have yet to meet a Black American. To the contrary, I have only met Black people attempting to be an image of white American. In turn, I have never met a white American. I have only met white people who are aspiring to a kamara or image of whiteness which does not exist on this planet. Yet, we all seem to be playing at some coloristic game of pretend in the United States of America. In this game, the Black Christian mystic is hidden as much as the Black Buddhist and Kemetic, as is the truth of our collective origin from Blackness, Black-skinned woman, and Black stellar space. I have an inkling that Howard Thurman and many other powerful and mystical cisgender males, including Siddhartha, were reliant, and even their mystical insights may have been, on a particular woman. In the case of Howard Thurman, his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, Sue Elvie Bailey, was an iconoclast and socially active partner. Aside from being the first non-white graduate of Oberlin University and helping to found the National Council of Black Women, she also surely supported Howard Thurman by helping to parent their children, Olive and Ann Thurman. The Universal Homo sapiens sapiens Cultural Experience, Hindu-based yoga. The collective expression of people is not one which can be monopolized by any subgrouping within the larger group of Homo sapiens sapiens. In this way, wisdom traditions ought to behave the same. Accordingly, no one subgroup or culture forever owns any wisdom tradition or spiritual expression of people, themselves, or any other, as solely founded and able to be expressed only through and by one subgroup. The countering perspective on the blending, evolving, and accommodating insight between various subcultures is a major discussion which dominates the religious studies field and is one themed around religious and cultural appropriation and commodification. Forms of wisdom, body, and spirit practice fall into a category of expressions of wisdom traditions from a subgrouping ethnicity of Homo sapiens sapiens. There are many subgroupings which make up a universal phenomenon of people culture, species. People are known as being a part of a unified, overarching grouping as a species. Species are separated from each other by their ability, or lack thereof, to reproduce outside of one's given biological species grouping. All people belong to the same species because we can reproduce with each other. Every fertile member of the Homo sapiens sapiens genus can reproduce with each other. In this way, all Homo sapiens sapiens belong to the same universal genetic family or earth lineage, even if we may believe we also belong within our perceived divisions as a part of a culture or ethnic grouping, which is sub to the collective cultural expression of every being enclosed in the grouping of people as a species. With this lens, it is plausible to assume that every expression of any member of any subgrouping or ethnicity, however seemingly unique or esoteric, is an extended expression of the original groupings of Homo sapiens sapiens. The appearing conclusion then becomes that every expression, being an evolution upon an original species grouping, makes every expression as belonging to the original as it does to the latter. In the Gregorian year 2020, we are many iterations removed from an original origin cultural expression of the monolithic groupings of people. Conditionally, involuntarily, appropriation is not a possibility unless one exists outside of the grouping of people. How can one take that which is emitted or created from and by the one as separate something from one to take as one's own? Potentially, the more relevant and accurate fallacy which comes to light in transliterations and translations of wisdom traditions between subgroupings is inaccuracy, ignorance, manipulation, propaganda, and the commodification of wisdom traditions. Yoga. Yoga undergoes certain acts of assimilation to its current social context. However, as convincingly argued by Max Weber, religion is a process of assimilation to the contingencies of social life. In regards to yoga, the text, Selling Yoga, From Counterculture to Pop Culture, is a comprehensive look at the phenomena of commodifying transliterated and translated wisdom traditions from the insight regarding the movement of Hindu-based yoga to the Western context in the United States of America. To many Shastorians and historians, the movement of Hindu-based yoga to the so-called Western world began with Theos Bernard returning to the United States of America from India in 1947 and publishing his text, Hatha Yoga, the report of a personal experience. Since its arrival, Hindu-based yoga has undergone an immense transition since the 1950s to present in the United States. In the text Selling Yoga, From Counterculture to Pop Culture, written by Andrea Jain, the overarching theme is mindfulness in the Western context and its applicability in relation to the so-called traditional Hindi-based mindfulness, yogic forms of practice and ritual. The text begins with an overview of the historical foundation to the yoga tradition as formulated in the Indus Valley region of the world, known as India in modern day 2020. The author explores the root of the word mindfulness and discusses briefly the potential mistranslation of the term sati as a plausible exit point from the tradition to a more modern, not-so-Eastern practice model. Translation is often the point where an ancient cultural attribute is morphed into a new form of expression. The false or inaccurate or misleading translations often allow for the new and contemporary participant to revalue the expression of the past and superimpose a new form. The questions which dominate the discussions surrounding this sequence are based on the right of a new subcultural outsider to interface and reestablish the original or source expression into an evolved state. Evolved in the sense that the tradition is adjusted and added to rather than dissolved completely and replaced. The procedure would be an act of devolution only when the power hierarchy, which places the source or origin at the top, is supplanted, replacing the highest position with the newest form of the expression. The new form, in this case US-based yoga, is a sort of evolution light upon the older, more ancient, and yet it also holds the added component of newness of context. The context matters when we are interfacing with various aspects of various ancient wisdom traditions. The thought is that any ancient insight was also found within the context of the social reality of the time. Concurrently, the ancient insight is only ancient to those who find themselves existing in some future time. To the ancient people, they were not ancient. The ancient wisdom, therefore, was sourced in the ancients' contemporary, seemingly appropriated from those who were supposed to be even more ancient, the ancients' ancestors, than the ancient ancestors appear to those in the contemporary. The current contemporary circumstance of postmodernity will surely be some future generations' ancient past. From this lens of interconnected intergenerational experiences, it appears that no one iteration or time frame of people's expression is more or less valid than any other in relation to insight. If the innate equity exists in regards to spiritual paths and wisdom traditions, then it is plausible to assert that no individual or individual subgrouping or subculture of the shared universal aspect of the culture of Homo sapiens sapiens has an exclusive right to any form of insight which appears before, during, or after one's existence. Furthermore, the ability to practice ancient Hindu yogic practices in the United States, therefore, could be perceived as an acceptable form of evolution upon the ancient practices. It could, however, be argued with a certain level of validity that various precautions and gestures of respect may be preferred or required as one subculture or ethnic group morphs another subgroup's wisdom traditions or spiritual insights, rituals, and practice. The text Selling Yoga, From Counterculture to Pop Culture, mainly focuses on the inaccurate exportation of Hindu yoga practices into the United States commodity culture. The process is often dependent on a practice of spiritual bypassing and is referred to as the appropriation of the source tradition. Inherent in the imbalance is the idea that a hierarchy of accuracy, relevancy, and validity exist, which places the origin subculture at the top and all other outsider subcultures stratified downwards towards the bottom. To superimpose a sort of spiritual egalitarianism over the spiritual wisdom tradition trajectory hierarchy could begin to balance the experience of procreating wisdom as belonging to everyone, everywhere, and outside of the scope or limitations of linear timeframes. The harm could be in the replacement of the new iteration of any given tradition over the validity of the origin. There could be and ought to be no hierarchy, that may be the middle way. A suggested way for people raised in the United States of America to engage in a wisdom tradition that one is born an outsider to, in this case, Hindu-based yoga. 1. Reorient one's wisdom and historical perspective from a Eurocentric, American-centric perspective to a more accurate universal, or at least a Hindu-centric lens. 2. From a Hindu-centric or universal-centric lens, one must diligently study and acknowledge the accurate histories of the Indus Valley region in its influences and its inhabitants as far back as one accurately can. 3. From a Hindu-centric lens, one must diligently and accurately study the rituals, practices, and insight from the various Hindu-based yoga traditions as far back as one accurately can. 4. Respectfully begin to traverse every step of the Hindu-based yogic path. One must not skip to the end of the path or overstep any part one has yet to proceed to in accordance with the origin of the Hindu yoga tradition. 5. Always give respect and credit to the steps of the path, to the tradition at the origin of the path. One must not pass the wisdom along as their own or capitalize, sell, or economically exploit the path. 6. One must follow the prescribed ethical and moral compass of the Hindu-based yogic tradition and the compasses which exist and existed within the traditions which inspired the Hindu-based yogic tradition. 7. When one is asked to reteach the path to another outsider, the person ought to accommodate only if the requester has themselves at least gone through the first 3 steps suggested here, and they have committed to the remainder of the steps. Disclaimer: if one cannot wholly participate and complete every subsequent step, then they ought to cease the path when they cease to achieve success. The path of interfacing with wisdom traditions outside of one's born blood and subcultural lineage is not required of every person. Transgender male privilege? ? My experience with the subject of queer rights has evolved over time. I am of the age that correlates with the first wave of millennial Americans. Being a part of that demographic has made me much more appreciative and welcoming of social advancements in regards to the rights of all people. The rights of the queer community are a part of the identities which millennials have supported in awakening to acceptance and transcendence in our collective cultural community. We still have much more progress to make in regards to gender and sexual identity rights. To continue the work of utilizing wisdom traditions to overcome limitations in consciousness in position to gender and sexuality identity is one task which I see myself as an ally to. My main focus, however, has been on the support of the world's largest statistically oppressed grouping, women. Cisgender women, specifically. This lens was born in me out of a sort of ego-based driven drive to protect my first offspring, happened to be born a cisgender daughter, from the cruelties of the world, one of which is misogyny and other impacts of patriarchy. In turn, my interest in the evolution of the queer movement is threefold. Primarily, to support the identities of all people in being expressed freely, safely, and without social consequences. Secondly, to look into the intersection of gender rights and queer rights. In specific, how do gender hierarchies and realities of unearned entitlements, called privileges, intersect with the trans-queer movement? Thirdly, to provide a nurturing household which encourages autonomy of self-identification of any kind, even identities which I do not identify, identities that have hurt me, and identities that I have hurt. I have spent some time in my life researching and taking courses in women's rights, feminist and womanist movements in the United States of America, both black and white perspectives. I also have taken a couple of academic courses on the progression of queer history and politics in the United States. The two layperson experiences with dipping my toes into the mass reservoir of queer resources, research, and insight have meshed to encourage me to practice non-misogynistic behaviors and even, at times, attempt to hold the patriarchy accountable for the massive inequities which exist in the United States of America between cisgender males and cisgender females, and maybe even between transgender females and transgender males. The cisgender versus the transgender is the dichotomy innately implied when one speaks on human sexuality in the United States of America. The sexuality spectrum concept is in itself limiting and inaccurate as a representation of the fullness of the living evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens' holistic sexuality expression and experience. The text, Feminism is Queer, written by Mimi Marinucci, is a great example of how a wave of feminism and queerism can transpire together as an evolution upon the conversation regarding power, equity, and intersectionality. The next step is to begin to dissect the intricate and insidious way in which patriarchy imposes misogynistic perceptions of power and implements them unjustly upon discussions taking place within the feminist and queer communities. The onus of the cisgender male heterosexual is to step back and allow for the balancing and eventual healing to occur within the groupings of feminist and queer. The addressal of power dynamics alone may not be conclusive. Therefore, the next stage may be to break down how a cisgender male experiences the world as compared to a transgender male in regards to allocation and actual access to male privilege or unearned entitlements. Is the experience the same? In which ways do they differ? To be inclusive, one may want to also investigate the differing experiences in regards to equity and justice between cisgender females and transgender females. Do transgender females lose access to male privileges, unearned entitlements, granted unjustly to cisgender males when a transgender woman transitions or transcends to identifying and living as woman identified? Can the transgender woman transition back to being a cisgender male and gain back possibly lost male-based social access and equity? Furthermore, what are the emotional and psychological tolls of having to weigh one's personal identity versus their social accessibility and safety? I have never witnessed or heard of an identity that does damage to another identity. However, I have heard of too many people who use their identity as a weapon to limit, destroy, or otherwise discredit other identities. When it comes to supporting people in freely finding and embodying their identity, it ought to be allowed outside of a preconceived spectrum of acceptable or available identities. In addition, the movement to expand identity consciousness could also be sensitive to one's inability or uninterest in identifying with their born identity. People ought not be forced to identify with an identity they were born with or that they had identified in any moment prior to the moment of present self-identification. In addition, there is a space for those who identify with the dominating identities of sexuality and gender. There is no space, however, for misogyny and anti-queer behavior, rhetoric, practices, etc. When I ponder the choice in identifications, I often think of an anecdote where a black-skinned person chooses to transition to a white-skinned identity, and they are still perceived as black. The discussion around chosen identity and social responses to those choices is relevant to the discussion on gender and sexual identity as well. I am not fully informed on how to sensitively have the discussion on the variables between racial and ethnic identity and sexual and gender identity, and how they inform our current situation regarding race as a divisive strategy as well as an identity. In reality, there are certain identities which appear nearly impossible to safely choose to identify as. In relation to the discussion around cisgender male privilege versus transgender male privilege, I feel uninformed. I feel that I am uninformed about the actual perspective of cisgender males and cisgender females because the subject appears to be taboo and mildly insulting, if not triggering, to have these discussions within a patriarch which works adamantly to create divisions in every social equity movement. In the feminist, womanist, and queer movements, the patriarchy is adept to bring up this gray area as a way to minimize the validity of queerness as an escape from socialized misogyny within a patriarchy. I fear that I, as a cisgender, heterosexual male, may also be playing into the narrative. Divine Fatherhood. The Immanent Frame, Secularism, Religion, and the Public Sphere is a series that was established as an effort to bring the discussion of religion, spirituality, and social integration to the forefront on a web-based media outlet. The specific topic stream which is discussed within this short piece is the Divine Fatherhood section. Religion is a loaded term with a plethora of valid interpretations of its meaning. One of the definitions, validated by Western Latin thought, is based upon linguistic research of the Mediterranean tongue. The interpretation posits that religion is meant as an exoteric and esoteric way to combine or blend various attributes, insights, practices, and beliefs. The eclectic definition of the term religion is one which many people are recently trending to adopt. In my updated view, religion could connote the meshing of various wisdom perspectives into a non-essentialized yet archetypal interreligious expression. Academically, the concept of religion is often taught through mythology and existing within an alternative, not necessarily historically accurate, and nonlinear dimension. Therefore, in the academies of higher learning, religion is often minimized as a pseudo-scholarly topic rather than an integral evolutionary component to the study of the values and expressions of the historical people. I choose to approach the study of religion in the academy as the historical framework of our philosophical journey as Homo sapiens sapiens. Under this definitive perspective, it is plausible to interact with religion as a form of drawing closer in relation to all other perspectives. To unite or blend could be determined to have deeper significance than the division that is often endemic to the actualization of religious hierarchy, principles, and gender lineage-based exclusionary practices. In this vein, to unite or blend could be determined to have deeper significance than the division that is often endemic to the actualization of religious hierarchy, principles, and gender lineage-based exclusionary practices. And under our postmodernist and present-day 2020 circumstances of divisions, discussions regarding aspects and identities of gender are relevant to the discussion of religion. The Divine Fatherhood section of the Immanent Frame Secularism, Religion, and Public Sphere series is one baby step in that direction. Fatherhood is generally implied to envelop the parental responsibilities, love, and commitment upon which the cisgender male activates ego-driven paternal practice. Ego-driven in the sense that there is yet to be generally discussed or acknowledged a parental gene or urge that exists in the innate and predisposed being of a cisgender male father, leaving only the prospect of selfishness and ego as a motivator for cisgender male participation in nurturing a child. The agency of the cisgender males in determining the reality of cisgender male parenting is solely the responsibility of the cisgender male. In the intern, the definitions and perceptions of what defines cisgender father has mainly been established clinically, socially, statistically, or religiously. The main focus of the Immanent Frame discussion on divine fatherhood is on the religious definition of fatherhood and its roots. In many different wisdom traditions, the Father, and the Divine Father specifically, is a foundational part of cosmogony. Furthermore, as a result of the introduction of patriarchy into most medieval, modern, and postmodern social structures, many ancient wisdom traditions that may have been egalitarian in an ancient time have been translated or transliterated into being a patriarchal essence. The imagery of fatherhood has been dominated by a promotion of toxic authoritativeness as an extension of attributes cherry-picked from the perception of a father God, further confusing the separation between creation and fatherhood as non-existent, therefore granting ultimate authority arbitrarily in the hands of the male extension of a perceived male creator God. The narrative of the Church has dominated the formulating of the image and progression of the status of the Creator Father. The story is perceived to have begun in biblical scripture and later become embodied by followers of the Church who have dominated the construction of the United States relationship of church and state as an institutional force. One article specifically in the Immanent Frame discussion is titled Bringing Fathers More Fully into View. The article delves into the specific progression of implementing an overarching concept of fatherhood into the postmodern Western patriarchal mindset and social reality. The article also focuses on the exodus of the Hebrew Jesus to Egypt, Africa, and the impact that the Western Catholic-based image of God, the Creator Father, had in solidifying one of the many ways that this God, Yuhevah, would nurture humanity through God's metaphoric relationship with the Son. The article posits Jesus as a migrant to Egypt from the modernly termed Middle East. The process of migration is a major component to the social evolution and blending of various evolved ethnic enclaves into more collaborative constructions, diverse of civilizations within one species. Hebrew Jesus making an exodus as a result of the pressure of the Father is illuminative of a nurturing component which establishes this God as a mortally behaving entity. The entity of God, who would interface with the karma of people, may be a God who holds some form of ego or attachment to people. The attachment that this God exhibits through the nurturing, protective behavior of an authoritative parent is one that the author asserts to imply an inequality between this God and many not gods, Jesus, disciples, and peoples. God is often set above as a creator, and this distinction often subtly, if not unconsciously, promotes God as superior to people. When God supplants the birthing woman as the creative force in humanity, the women are innately devalued. The supplanting of God above woman, in the creative sense, was most likely done through male-oriented and misogynistically translated ancient wisdom text. To remedy the false shifting of creative powers, it is pertinent for people in the postmodern and millennial era to continue to prioritize accuracy and ethics as we continue to revisit and revalue wisdom from various, often contradictory, wisdom civilizations. The article also purports that God could be viewed as a non-toxic representation of fatherhood. The doting nature of God, which bleeds out in this lens, could be perceived as virtuous, protective, and consistent. In a time and country where too many cisgender males do not raise their offsprings, the redetermining of the role and quality of the protective father as an expression of God's power could motivate deadbeat fathers to be more participatory in the evolution of their children. About the author. I have lived an extensive and unique existence. I was adopted in the early 1980s during the U.S. crack epidemic. The epidemic destroyed my biological family and resulted in my transition to the foster care system. I was then adopted by a loving family. My youth was full of experiences which were meant to displace my biology and insert the ethos of a lower middle-class American. I had an engaging and alternative childhood. As a result, I chose to apply to attend Lehman Alternative Community School of Ithaca, New York. I was accepted and graduated from the alternative high school with a developed and open-minded perspective on educational philosophy and life-learning skill engagement prioritization. Throughout my youth and secondary experiences, I was engaged in extracurricular activities and volunteer opportunities. I also maintained quality academic success and a full artistic and athletic life. Shortly before attending college following high school, I became an engaged teenage father. My academic and economic goals were placed as a secondary priority to engagingly raising my daughter. Once I was able to secure stability for the mother of my children and my first daughter, I enrolled in college. My first degree was achieved in the Early Childhood Education AAS program through Tompkins County Community College in South Central New York. I was honored by the Phi Theta Kappa for academic success through my community college experience. I was rewarded with acceptance into a 4-year undergraduate program in history at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Upon enrollment into Ithaca College, I was blessed with the arrival of my second daughter. I balanced the challenges of rigorous academics, parenting, and social engagement while attempting to complete my degree. While overcoming the circumstances of parenting, living in poverty, separating from my daughter's mother, and becoming a single father, engaging as the PTA president of my daughter's elementary school, and completing 18 credit hours, I was able to graduate from Ithaca College in 2008. I then entered the workforce and held positions in the social service and education sector over the next several years until moving to Boulder, Colorado. While living in Boulder, Colorado, I have raised my 4 children alone and completed a master's in contemplative religious studies from Naropa University. I am now a new student at the California Institute of Integral Studies, completing my PhD in Eastern and Western psychology. Throughout my life journey, I have had many challenges to my sustenance. I have always maintained faith in the existence and prevalence of goodness. Remember, good people, all matter moves.